As I mentioned before, this webinar today is all about basic portrait editing here inside the entire Perfect Photo Suite. We're not just going to be talking about Perfect Portrait, we're actually going to be talking about some of the other programs that you can use to enhance an image like this one. We're going to be working also in the program pretty much as a standalone today because there are lots of different modules that I'm going to be showing you. But if you're a user of a program like Lightroom or Aperture, everything that we do today, you'll be able to do as a plugin for either of those programs. If you are a Photoshop or a Photoshop Elements user, it's important to note that neither of those programs allow you to have access to this specific layers program because Photoshop and Photoshop Elements are layered-based programs, so you don't necessarily need two of them. So you'll probably end up using the suite the way that I am as a standalone today. So just a little heads up about working with the program as a whole, but pretty much everything that you can do, as long as you have the entire version of the Perfect Photo Suite, you've got all those modules, you'll be able to do everything that I'm doing today. Now, we're going to be starting out with this image here, and I'm actually going to spend the whole 45 minutes talking through different parts of this image that we can work on. And there's lots of stuff that we're going to cover. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just basic retouching. You can actually do retouching here inside of Perfect Layers, as well as inside Perfect Portrait. A lot of people don't know that Layers has a whole bunch of retouching tools. So if you'd like to, you can access them here. And they're on the left-hand side of the screen. They're called the Perfect Eraser and the Retouch Brush. We also have something called the Clone Stamp Brush, which is extremely useful for very difficult areas. The eraser and the retouch brush can also be found inside Perfect Portrait, and that's where we're going to be using it. But I like to point that out here just in case you are a standalone user and you don't want to go into Perfect Portrait to use all of its different tools and whatnot. You can just access those retouching tools on the left-hand side of your screen. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to Portrait. A quick overview of Portrait as it's finding the facial features is it's looking for the face or faces in an image, and it's going to place a green rectangle around the face or faces that it finds. So it's paying attention to facial feature points like your eyes, the whites of your eyes, the pupils of your eyes, and the irises. It's looking for the lips, and if they're smiling with teeth, it's going to look for the teeth. And then it's also just going to look for the face as a whole, so it's looking for skin tones. To zoom in to get a closer look at the face itself, you want to click inside that green box, and it will show you the actual points that it's placed around the eyes, the lips, and the teeth. Now, these control points can be clicked and dragged on and moved to fit into place. So you'll see that it did a pretty good job selecting the eyes, but for some reason it went a little too far with the mouth. There's a top section here on the mouth that's supposed to be for the top lip, and then a bottom section that's for the bottom lip. But there's also this little middle section for teeth, and she's not smiling with teeth. So I'm just going to click and drag to push those two little center spots together so that we don't whiten any of her lips. That would be a little strange. And then I'll click and drag this control point on the right to make sure that I get all of her mouth. Now you can click and move these around to make sure that you get every single piece of whatever part of the image you're working on. So I wanted to move that control point over to get all of the lips. And I'm going to do the same up here where the eyes are as well. I want to get as much of the eyes as possible in here because I want to get all the whites and all of the irises so that I can add a little bit of whitening and a little bit of detail. Those little blue or cyan dots that you're seeing in the center of the eyes indicate the pupils. So just in case you're working on an image and maybe someone is turned to the side just a little bit and it didn't quite find the eye itself right away, that's totally fine. You can actually click and drag that little blue dot and you can move the eye selection around. So if for some reason it didn't do the best job of selecting it, you can always just scoot that entire thing around, which is really nice. All right, so we've got our control points in place. Up in the top right-hand corner, you want to click on the Hide Controls button, and that will hide those little points so that you don't have to stare at them while you're making any edits. On the right-hand side, this is where the bulk of the retouching is going to happen. At the top, you have your skin retouching paint, and it's already applied a baseline amount of defaults. So you should already see that the skin is looking a little bit softer here, and some of the pores are starting to disappear just a little bit, so they're getting a little bit softer. And that's because it's already applied blemish removal and smoothing, as well as something called evenness, which evens out the color in the skin tone. So if you have someone who has kind of redder, blotchier skin, that evenness slider can help save it. You can move any of these sliders to the right to either push them up more. So if I want to smooth her skin a little bit more, I'll just move that over to the right and you'll see it softens. I can add shine reduction here if she's got brighter areas that I want to reduce. Be careful how far you go over with the shine slider because you can end up with these kind of flatter faces, and you want to be really careful because skin just naturally has shine on it. So you want to leave a little bit there so that their face still has some nice depth and dimension. There's a shadow recovery slider, which can be good if someone has really prominent under eye circles, which she doesn't, so we don't need to worry about it. You can add texture back in to skin just in case you've over smoothed it or part of the skin is a little overexposed and the texture seems to have kind of disappeared. You can add some texture, and then we can also go in and add a little bit more evenness to flatten out that skin tone. Now, down below, we have the color correction pane, which will color correct your image based on the skin tone it has selected instead of a white point, which we don't need. This is a studio shot. That's why I chose it. So don't really need to color correct it. I'm going to jump right down to the eyes and mouth pane. The whitening slider for the eyes will pop out the whites of the eyes quite a bit. And you can see if I move this slider, it's already pushed up to 50 as a default, but if I push this back down to 100, the whites of her eyes are a little darker, a little bit grayer. And so to make her eyes appear brighter, we can push that whitening slider over. I recommend not going up too far because if you go really overboard, it can look really fake. And it can make the image itself look a little over retouched. So I like to keep this down as low as I possibly can get away with it so it doesn't look too fake. And then the detail slider adds detail to the irises of the eyes. So if I move that to the left, her eyes look kind of soft and a little foggy. But if I move them over, it crisps it up and it adds a little bit of contrast and vibrance into the irises. So now you can really see that kind of central ring around her pupils and that the blue of her eyes is starting to stand out a bit more. There's also a teeth whitening, just in case they're smiling with teeth and you need to whiten that, you can go ahead and do that. And then there's also a vibrance slider, which will pump up the vibrance of the lips. So you'll see now it just kind of looks like she's got a little bit more of like a tinted lip gloss on versus a flatter color. So the vibrance slider can just be nice for making sure that those lips don't look a little too dull or nude. Now, one of the things that is very important about the way that Perfect Portrait works is the skin selection. So we already took a look at those control points around the eyes and the lips. But what's also happening is the program itself is selecting which parts are counted as skin and which parts are not skin. Anytime that I'm hovering my mouse over the image, you should be seeing this little brush that's popping up. This brush indicates that I can paint in sections that should be part of the skin selection, or I can remove parts of the image that may have accidentally been softened. Sometimes what can happen when you have, this girl has kind of palish skin, lightly tanned skin, but she also has palish blonde hair. And so sometimes they can blend together. If you have someone who has pretty close skin and hair tones, like a lot of times I notice this very prominently with women who have blonde hair and kind of palish skin or like lightly tanned skin. The hair and the skin itself sometimes blend together. They're similar enough that the program has a hard time saying, okay, what's skin, what's not skin. One of the best ways to take a look at what the skin selection is, because we can't actually see a representation of it right now, is to go down to the bottom left-hand corner of your image, and there's this little after drop-down menu that I'm kind of hovering my mouse around. When I open this up, it shows that I can take a look at my mask itself. I choose an option called Mask Red. It's my favorite option because it's going to place a red overlay on top of everywhere in the image that is not being affected by the skin selection. You'll notice that it's selected some of the hair on the right-hand side of her face, and that is accidentally being softened along with her skin. It's also selected a little too much of the eyebrows. We want to clean those out. And we also want to make sure that areas like the creases of her eyes don't get softened as well. So to use this brush tool, just go up to the tool options bar. You want to set your mode, whether you need to add something to the skin selection or remove it from the skin selection. And then you can adjust things like the size, the feathering amount, and the opacity. My favorite option is something called our perfect brush, and this is our edge detection brush. It's very useful in situations like this where you need to get very exact around spots like the eyebrows and the eyes, the hair, and so on. It pays attention to color information underneath the crosshair of the brush so that you only paint in or out the sections that you want. So I'm just going to start clicking and dragging, and I can make my brush bigger or smaller depending on what I want. If you accidentally make a mistake, remember that you can go up to your mode menu and swap this to add to skin. So if you do make a mistake by accident, it's not the end of the world. You always have the ability to mask in and out. So we'll swap that back to not skin. And with the perfect brush, I'm not too worried about adding any of her skin in there. It's doing a pretty good job of selecting around her face. So we're not getting on her skin itself. And we're just kind of clicking and dragging over here. I'm going to do the same thing up on the left-hand side. I'm going to make sure that I get all of her hair along the edge because we don't want to soften too much of her hairline over there. And then I'm also going to paint out her eyebrows because we don't want to soften any of her eyebrows. Sometimes that can be a good indicator that someone hasn't done a very good job with retouching. If the eyebrows look kind of hazy or faded, that can give off a very fake look. So I like to make sure that those eyebrows stay nice and crisp. And then last, I'm going to paint around kind of the edge of the eye to make sure that we don't soften around the creases because that can also give an indication that someone has over retouched. If the creases look soft and faded, it definitely means that they over softened the image as a whole. So I like to go around the entire eye to make sure that those stay nice and crisp. All right, so now we've got a much better skin selection than what we started out with. We had all this extra hair, we had all the eyebrows that were soft, there were a whole bunch of creases that were soft, and now we've got a much better facial selection that's going to work better with all of those changes that we made in our skin retouching paint. So to take a look at our after image, go back to that drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and just swap this over to after. Now we can definitely see that we still have a whole bunch of information in the hair on the right, so it's not quite as soft. The creases on her eyes look a little bit crisper, so it doesn't look like she's been overly softened, and her eyebrows have come back. So now they've got a nice crisp edge around them. So again, it doesn't look kind of hazy and soft. One of the last things that you'll want to do here inside Portrait is use the retouching tools that I pointed out inside of Perfect Layers, and you'll find them in your tool well on the left-hand side. She doesn't have too many blemishes, but she's got a couple little ones like right on the bottom left of her mouth right here. And I can zoom in a bit more so we can take a closer look at some of those blemishes. The skin retouching paint did a pretty good job of softening a lot of these little specks and larger pores that we wanted to get rid of, but sometimes it can't always remove spots like acne or just larger blemishes that someone might have on their face. And so that's when the retouching tools come in handy. The Perfect Eraser is a content-aware fill tool, which means that it pays attention to its surroundings and it tries to fill in the spot that you paint over with smart information surrounding the brush itself. So I like to use the Perfect Eraser when doing these kind of bigger blemishes. And just click and drag, and it does a great job of replicating the skin texture without me having to really do anything. And I'm just clicking very, very quickly on any of the little spots that I want to remove. So if she had any extra little areas that I didn't like, if she had little spots that I didn't think were looking very good, if she had maybe like a freckle that she didn't like or a mole she didn't like, anything that's out of the ordinary that you don't necessarily want on your photo, just click and drag and get rid of it. It's really good for stray hairs if you want to remove spots on someone's face that have stray hairs, or maybe if there's one that's a little distracting in the hair itself, like that little white hair that was coming down this darker brown, we'll just go through and click and drag to remove it. They have areas around their eyebrows that you want to clean up a little bit, spots of excess makeup, anything big and kind of complicated that you want to remove, the perfect eraser is there. Now we also have something called the retouch brush, and it works very differently. And I much prefer it for softer areas of the image that we want to soften and reduce, not completely remove. One of the things about the retouch brush, and I'm going to use it at 100%, is when you go through and try and remove something, it pays attention to the area around it, but it also creates kind of a replicating pattern that can be very distracting. And so the way that I like to use the retouch brush is by going up to the tool options bar and lowering the opacity of the brush. So I drop it down to about 30 or 40. And now what's going to happen is let's go through and let's soften some of these wrinkles and this area right underneath her eye. We'll click and drag, and we will click and drag very slowly kind of on these little spots around her eyes. And all we're doing is we're softening the under eye, and we're not completely getting rid of it. One of the biggest problems that people run into when they're doing retouching is they completely remove all traces that someone had freckles or someone had a mole or that someone had wrinkles or hair slightly out of place. And while there are some distractions that are perfectly understandable to remove, like she probably doesn't want a little spot of acne on her face, you don't want to completely remove things like under eyes because it can make someone look very, very fake. It makes them look kind of like a doll. And that can be kind of distracting. When you're looking at a portrait of someone, you don't want to say, oh, this is very photoshopped. You want to look at it and go, wow, that's a really nice portrait. And so the retouch brush does a good job of just softening areas without completely getting rid of them. This is also a really good tool if you want to soften areas of shine. So make my brush a little bit bigger and just kind of click and drag along her forehead here. And it doesn't immediately, when you look at it, doesn't immediately shout, oh, I just removed all that shine. But you'll notice that those bright white pixels that we were looking at are now just a little bit more skin tone or skin flesh colored. And I can do the same thing on any of the other little bright spots on her face that I want to get rid of. All with this lower opacity retouch brush. And you can use this across the board to create kind of a softer gradient on skin. One of the last tools that I like to use this for is you can also use it to soften chapped lips. So sometimes I'll run this across somebody's lip, and it just softens out some of those harder edges. Now, let's go ahead and let's take a look at our before and our after really quick. I'm going to go through and click on the Apply button on the bottom right-hand corner. It's going to go through and it's going to add all those effects that we just added in Perfect Portrait, and it's going to bring me back into Perfect Layers. And we can take a look at that before and after here. Just by playing in our Layers palette, we can turn this Perfect Portrait layer on and off just by clicking the eye icon next to it. So this was our original image. This is what we started out with, and this is what we ended up with. Now, if you weren't talking for the last 15 minutes trying to explain everything, you could probably do this a little bit faster and you could do it again without the distraction of talking. But you can see we did this in less than less than 20 minutes, less than 15 minutes almost. So I've only been talking to you guys for about 15 minutes or so, and we did most of this retouching in that period of time. So it's very, very quick, very basic adjustments, but we still have some facial features. Like you can tell that she has skin texture. You can see her pores. You can see that she's got shadows and highlights on her skin. You can still see that she's got some wrinkles and some under eye circles, but they're not so completely removed that she looks like a doll. So our original image and our after. Now that's kind of a basic overview of using Perfect Portrait. Now, there are lots of other ways that you can go through and enhance portraits as a whole. And one of my favorites is by adding a new background. I work in a studio and I take pictures of people up against backdrops. And this blue backdrop is one of the ones that's at the studio itself. And it's one of my favorites, partially because it's a very easy background to remove. Not a lot of people have blue skin or blue hair. And if they do, I end up using a different backdrop. I photographed a girl with bright blue hair once, and I shot her on a white backdrop because it was much easier to see. But for the most part, people are not blue themselves or do not have blue hair. So it's a great background to remove people from. So I want to go in and add something a little bit more interesting to the background itself. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have something called our Extras tab here in Perfect Layers. And this is where you're going to find all of the on-one extras that you can access when you buy the photo suite itself. We have backgrounds, borders, and textures, and they're all free. They're all part of the suite. The backgrounds category is sectioned out into different types of backgrounds that you'd like to apply. And the one that I almost always go to is studio backdrops, because I don't necessarily want to put a sky behind her. I'm not really sure that would look quite right. I could always do that. That's always really fun. And you can see that you've got a lot of really cool skies here. But she doesn't really look like she would be up against any of these skies. It's kind of a little strange. So skies are out. Gradients are a little too simple. Don't necessarily want a soft gradient. There's a walls section, which is really fun. There's some good like grunge and grit in here. And a lot of them are kind of like urban exploration, really kind of texturized backgrounds. And these can be really fun too. There's also inside and outside. So we have inside textures like Grand Central Station. We've got different locations like churches, abandoned buildings, and so on. And then outside has some really fun stuff like roads that you can place them on in front of the Eiffel Tower and so on. Now, in the studio backdrops category, you get all of these really cool, kind of fun patterned backdrops. And the reason why I really like these is because I tend to like that kind of grungier, like interesting background behind them. I don't necessarily want to make this look very realistic. I want to give it something a little bit more interesting in the background to give it some pizzazz, if you will. The plain blue is not really doing it for me, so I want to add something that's got a little bit more of a texture to it. Now, there are lots of different options in here that you can play around with. It's completely up to you on what color you're interested in applying, what style you're looking for. One of my favorites are these brocade backdrops, and that's what I'm going to end up using. So to apply a backdrop from your extras category, just double click on the one that you like. This dialog is going to open up and ask you whether you'd like to edit a copy, which we don't want to do. We want to go down and choose the Add as a Layer option. We want to add this as a layer into our layer stack, and we'll click OK. Now it's going to place it on top of our photo. And one of the things that you'll notice is it's a little bit bigger than our original image. So the first thing that we need to do is size it down. We have something called our Transform tool, which you'll find on the left-hand side, right up at the top. And if I zoom out, which zooming in and out is Control or Command plus or minus. If I zoom out, finally you'll see that the bounding box is all the way on the outside of the image. So this texture is pretty big. Now I can shrink it down and I can size it so that it'll fit with my image. But I don't necessarily want to go through all of the work of zooming out, trying to figure out how to do that, and so on. So there's a button up when you have the Transform tool selected. There's a button up in the top right-hand corner in your tool options bar called Fill. This will resize this texture layer, this background layer, to fill with the image beneath it. So when I click that button, all of a sudden the texture is shrunk and that bounding box is right along the outside of the photo. Then when I'm done, I'll click Apply. It will save that change, and now that layer has been sized correctly. Then on the right-hand side of my layer stack, I'm going to select my backdrop and click and drag it underneath my photo layer so we can't see it. Then click on the portrait layer that's on top. So this is my perfect portrait layer. And when I turn it on and off, you'll see that backdrop. And then we want to take it into perfect mask. If you have a very simple, someone who doesn't have a lot of hair, you have someone who doesn't have any stray clothing, who doesn't have any like crazy anything. If you have the most easy mask in the world, you can go through and you can use the masking brush that's here inside of Perfect Layers. It's a great tool. And when you use our perfect brush, which is what we were using earlier in Perfect Portrait, it can do a pretty good job of getting along the edge. But sometimes what can happen is when you do have someone who has hair, you can end up with a little bit of a halo around the edge of your mask. And that's that kind of blue layer that you're seeing. So we want to go into perfect mask so that we can get more of an advanced masking technique on our image. So we'll click on it in the top right-hand corner. It's going through and it's segmenting the image into color information, which is how perfect mask works. It pays attention to the colors in the photo and not the edges, so that it's easier to separate. And then on the left-hand side, we're going to start out by using our drop brush tool. This tells the program which colors we want to drop out or we want to remove. So all I'm going to do is just click and drag on the left-hand side to remove that blue, and the right-hand side to remove the blue over there. Now we still have that haloing effect, which is what you were seeing in Perfect Layers, and we need to go through and remove that. So the tool that's right underneath the drop brush is something called the Refine brush. And this is what you're going to use to make it so that those edges have nice kind of like hair that's going through. It's soft. It's going to remove the blue, but it's going to leave everything else behind. So we'll just click and drag it along the edge of her hair, and it gets rid of the blue, but it still leaves that soft kind of hazy blonde behind. And we'll use that kind of right along the edge of her side too, because we want to get rid of as much as possible. You don't want to go through and leave any areas that may have a little bit of blue, because then it'll be obvious that we went through and removed a background. So you want to be very careful about removing as much as you possibly can. So we'll go through and remove all of that. And there we go. Now, once we're done here and we finished out and we've removed the background, we'll click Apply, and it's going to bring us back into Perfect Layers. Now, what's really cool about working with a new background or, working with these two separate layers, we have one that's just the girl and we have one that's just the backdrop. So by having them separate, we can edit them separately. So let's start out by editing the background. One of the things that you may have noticed by now is that the background itself is really crisp. It's very in focus. And her hair, I used a pretty low, small aperture for this. So I have a slightly more shallow depth of field, if you will. So the back part of where her hair is kind of hazy. It's slightly out of focus. And the background is in focus. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we want to go through and we want to adjust just the background. So inside of Perfect Layers, we have our backdrop selected, and we'll click on Perfect Effects. Now what we want to do is blur this. So I'm going to go over to the left-hand side. We're going to choose an option called Lens Blur. And you'll see there are many different options here. You can also access the Lens Blur filter by going over to the right-hand side in your Filter Options pane and opening up the Filter drop-down menu. From here, you'll also find Lens Blur. This is less visually appealing than you'll see on the left-hand side where you get previews, but it's also another way that you can add the same filter. Now, once we've gone through and applied it, it's going to add a masking bug to our image, which means that it's asking us which part of our photo we want to keep in focus and which part we don't. So I can use this masking bug to select which part of our image will remain in focus. But the thing that I want to make sure I'm pointing out here is take a look at the fact that the subject itself is not blurred. Because these photos are separate in the layer stack, it's not affecting the subject and it's only blurring the backdrop. That's exactly what we want. Now I'm just going to click and drag this little masking bug, and we're going to move it behind the subject so we can't actually see it. Now you can't tell that there's an area that's in focus or out of focus, and that's what we're looking for. We want there to be a section of the image that remains in focus, and that's the subject, so we're good. Down below, in the lens blur filter options pane, we can adjust the type of blur that's being applied to the photo. So there's the amount of blur, which is really important. We can lessen it, or we can increase it if we just want kind of a soft haze. I'm going to drop this down to probably about maybe 9 looks good. It's still soft, but we can still see the pattern, which is exactly what we're going for. You can go down, and one of my favorite options is down at the bottom. It's the brightness and contrast sliders. We can lighten or darken the background. So I'm probably going to end up lightening it because I want to make it a little bit brighter. It makes everything in her skin tone, her eyes pop out a little bit more. And then we'll add some contrast in there so that the light and the dark blues in the background are a little bit more contrasted. So they pop out a bit more. You can still see that texture. One of the other really fun things is if you apply a backdrop and you say, maybe it's not necessarily the color you are looking for. Here inside Perfect Effects, if I click the plus button down on the bottom of my filter stack on the left-hand side, it's going to add another filter that I can apply to this image. So the one that we're going to use is, I'm going to close up that lens blur filter, is something called the photo filter layer. It's down right underneath the lens blur, and you can see it's going to add a color overlay to the background. So if we want to make it a little bit more purple blue, we could add this ADA filter. If we scroll down, we could make it a little bit more green. We could add a deep red one. There's purples and there's blues and greens and magentas and oranges and so on. So there are tons of different colors that we can apply. I'm going to scroll down and let's try adding this yellow. So we get kind of this almost vintage style background. That looks pretty cool. So on the right-hand side in the filter stack, you'll see the photo filter layers on top of our lens blur filter. And then down below in our filter options pane, we can adjust things like the color of the filter. We can adjust the saturation of it. We can adjust the mode and the strength. There are tons of fun options. I won't go through all of them because there's still some other fun stuff I want to show you guys, but you can see that you can make a lot of changes. And because these are separated, we don't have to worry about affecting our subject in any way. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click apply. It's going to go through and it's going to bring us back into perfect layers. So now we have our original backdrop, which is that kind of bright blue, kind of dark, very in focus brocade pattern. And then the one that we just created, a little soft focus. We've got this cooler vintage style on it. So it's like a blue to yellow look, which is really cool. It's more of what I was going for. Now, separating these two images can be very useful and can be a great option. But sometimes you want to edit the image as a whole. One of the biggest things that can be frustrating if you're editing images separately is, what if I wanted to add a vignette? If I wanted to finish this off with a vignette, I would have a really hard time with these two photos as a separate, because if I added it to just the background, it wouldn't add any darkness to the edges of her on the top right or the bottom right. And that would be a clear indication that the layers themselves were separated. So to combine the layers in your layer stack, you can go up to the layer drop-down menu and scroll down to an option called New Stamped Layer. This is going to merge all of the layers in your layer stack into one individual layer that is now You're not going to see any change when I turn it on and off because it's all of those different layers pulled into one. So it's our foreground and our new background together. Now when I take this into Perfect Effects, which is where we're going to end up because I've got another couple of minutes of fun things we can do to portraits in Perfect Effects. If I, for instance, add a photo filter layer, I'm just going to click on a random one, it's adding it to the whole photo. So whether you want to edit them separately or together, you can choose to do that, and that can be really helpful. Now, one of my favorite things to do here inside of Perfect Effects is to apply vintage effects. And these are very popular nowadays, vintage and antique stylings, making your photos look like they were shot with film. We have programs like Instagram and lots of photo editors like Faded, and they're a lot of fun. And most of them center around the idea that you want to make your images look like an old negative or an old Polaroid. One of my favorites is a photo editing app called Afterlight, and all it does is create vintage effects, and it's awesome. So they're very popular nowadays, especially on our phones. And there are lots of different ways that you can recreate that style here in Perfect Effects. We have something called our vintage filter, and this is definitely one of our most popular ones since we came out with Photo Suite 8 and Perfect Effects 8, and it's one that I use almost all the time. And as you can already see, you're getting some really cool styles on your images. You can use one called Lo-Fi, which is this almost Holga style, very high contrast effect. There's ones like Red Yellow, which is this soft, faded, like 1970s negative, and so on. So you can go through and you can choose which one you want to apply. I'm going to select this one called Cool and click once. Now, the way that the vintage filter works is very simple. You have a style drop-down menu. This is the color styling you'd like to add, and each one is a little bit different, and you can use it in a slightly different way. Oatmeal is one of my favorites. I use this all the time on my photos, and I think it's really fun, especially on portraits because most people already have that warmer skin tone. It just kind of enhances that warmth and makes the entire image look warmer. Ocean is another favorite because it adds more of a faded style to an image, so it looks like it's been sitting out in the sun for a while, and that can be very popular. So we have tons of different stylings that you can add. I'm going to go up and we're going to stick with Cool. It's very simple, very subtle, but it pulls the entire image together with the vintage background, and now she has that nice tone on her, so it matches. The amount slider just controls the intensity of the color style. So if I drop it to the left, it pulls me back to my original image, and then as I push it to the right, it adds that color more and more. And then the saturation slider just affects the color saturation of the baseline image. So if I desaturate this all the way, that blue-yellow that's being added to the image stays the same, but she, as the subject, is desaturated. If I push this over to the right, it's going to intensify the colors in the background. So you can choose whether you'd like to mute it or whether you'd like to intensify those colors a bit more. It's completely dependent on the image. For this photo, I kind of like the idea of adding a bit more of her original color in there. Now, there are lots of other filters that you can use to enhance your images. One of my favorites is down at the bottom of your filter stack, and it's called the adjustment brush filter. It's indicated by a brush icon with a plus and a minus next to it. And when you select it and you click it, nothing is actually going to happen to your image yet. And that's what we're going for. These are called paint in effects, which means that we have to paint in a change selectively on part of our photo. Down in the filter options pane, you can choose what type of change you'd like to paint into your image. So for this one, the preset automatically is set to lighten, which means that wherever we paint, which I'm going to go through and I'm going to paint across the image, is going to get lighter. Now, you can select whatever adjustment that you'd like to add. So there's brightness, which is nice. We've got contrast, we have detail, we've got different color adjustments. You can even add a glow. So there's lots of different ways that you can go through and you can make adjustments here. I'm going to leave it on that lighten preset and maybe just drop the brightness down a little bit. Now, one of the best ways that you can enhance facial features is by adjusting the lightness and the darkness of certain parts of someone's face. It helps bring out certain facial features like the eyes. By darkening the eyebrows, you can intensify someone's face a little bit more. And by adding highlights to someone's hair, or maybe adding a little bit of lightness or darkness to their lips, you can completely change how their face is shaped. So with this brightness slider moved over, I'm going to go up to my tool options bar, and I'm going to adjust my feathering amount and push it all the way up to 100. I want a very soft edged brush. Now, as I paint, which I'm going to do, you'll notice that the lightness that it's applying is very intense. One of the things that I like to do is also lower the opacity a little bit. By doing that, you get a bit more control over how much lightness you're applying at a specific time, because there are some areas where you're going to want to add more and others where you're going to want to add less. So these tool options up at the top are very important to creating a very well-rounded portrait. Now let's zoom in a little bit so we can get a closer look at her face, and we're going to go through and add a little bit of lightness on her forehead. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller and do it kind of right along the nose, right there. I'm going to do it underneath the eyes, maybe once or twice, and you can pull that out. There we go. Now, just like with any of the other brush tools, if you make a mistake, you can always swap your mode from paint in to paint out. So if I lightened too much along the eyes, I can just remove that. What's really nice about that is when you paint out, you can also paint out with a lower opacity. And that, again, will help everything blend together a bit better. So swap that back over to paint in. We're going to lighten up those under eyes a bit, make sure they're nice and bright. We're going to go through and add a little bit of brightness to the chin, maybe a little bit to right underneath the nose where the lips are. And there we go. Now, once we've gone through and we've added a little bit of lightness here, you can go up to your filter stack, and you can also play around with your layer opacity. This is just a way for you to either remove strength from this layer or increase it. So if I move this to the left, slowly that lightness will start to disappear. So if maybe I went a little overboard and I did a little too much, I can just scoot my layer opacity down. Now what I like to do when I'm working with these adjustment brushes is I add two of them. I add one that's lightness, and then I add another that's basically darkening. It's doing the opposite. So there's a preset that you'll find at the top of the filter options pane when you add an adjustment brush, and it's just darken, and it's the exact opposite. I'll probably lower that brightness just again because I don't want to go too overboard. It's saved all of my different brush options, so I don't have to worry about adjusting my feather or my opacity. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to darken. So we'll darken her eyebrows. I might darken her eyelashes a little bit, which can make her eyes look a little bit more fierce, a little bit more intense, and that can be really nice. If you'd like to be very exact, don't forget you have your perfect brush, just like all other brushes in the perfect photo suite. You have access to your brush, your perfect brush. So we'll intensify that. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger and add a little bit of a kind of darkening effect right there so that she's got more definition along her cheeks. And then we'll darken that area right along her nose, maybe the corner of her mouth, just a bit. You can also go through and if you want to darken areas of her hair, so maybe we don't necessarily like all of the lightness on the hair, we want to darken the tops a bit more, we can use this not just on the face, but also on different parts of the image. Now, I zoomed out really quick so that we can take a look at the before and after with and without these layers. It's a very subtle change, but it's one of my favorite things to do in a portrait. So we'll take this and we will take a look at our original image, which still has no vintage effect on it. And then our after image, where we've gone through and we've adjusted the face, and we've gone in and we've changed the way that all of those different facial features look. So we really kind of honed in and added a little bit more contrast to her cheekbones so they look a little bit higher. We added a little bit of brightness underneath her eyes, which is one of my favorite options because it can really brighten people's faces up. And then we also added a little bit more dimension to to her forehead and her nose, which again can do things like slender down someone's nose if it's a little bigger. And you can also go through and make adjustments to areas like the cheeks and the chins to make them look a little bit smaller, a little bit larger. And we're not using any liquefying techniques. We're not changing the way that this person's face shape actually is. It's the same as using digital makeup. So it's the same as what women do in the morning when we put on bronzer and blush and highlighters. We're just doing it digitally here. So very, very fun changes that you can make to your images. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is add a very quick vignette just to finish the image off as a whole. I want to go in and we're going to add actually a specialized vignette. And you'll find it in the filters library on the left-hand side. Open up the vignette pane. You'll see you've got lots of different options for vignettes you can apply. And there are other ways to finish off your images. I jumped straight to vignette, but I want to make sure you guys know that there are many other ways you can finish your images off. So vignettes are a good way. They're one of the ways that I like to finish my photos off. And you can go in and you can also add things like borders and textures. So don't think you're stuck with your vignettes. If you really like to add borders, you can go through and do that. You can also add borders and textures inside of perfect layers too, which is really fun. And I like to do that because you get a slightly different control over how those borders and textures work with your image. You just get a couple of interesting options inside of layers that can be really fun. If you wanted to take this image and bring it into black and white because you're interested in doing that, you can also do that. So I brought up vignettes because it's a good way that I like to finish my images off, but not everybody feels that way. So I'll go ahead and when you're done in here and you've added all of your kind of final effects and you click apply, it's going to once again bring me back into perfect layers. And what's really nice is everything here has been placed on a separate layer. So we can actually go all the way back to our original image and take a look at what we started with. So I'm going to go through and we are going to hide all of these different layers so that we can take a look. So we started out with this. This was our first photo. No retouching, no background changes. We went through and we adjusted the girl herself. So we actually went in and we retouched, and you can really see, especially when we zoom into her face, you can really see the change that happened when we went in and we adjusted her skin. Then we also went through and we added a backdrop. We adjusted that backdrop. We created that duplicate layer so that we didn't destroy our layered workflow. And then we ended up with this inside Perfect Effects. And you can really see that that facial sculpting makes a pretty big difference that we were doing with or without the vintage effect. That was just one of my ways that I really like to work with my photos, but again, it's totally up to you. And now if I wanted to, I could go in and add my border, my texture. I could jump back into effects and add a vignette. I can finish my image off by taking it into black and white if I'm interested in doing that, and so many other options here. So there are tons of different ways where we can kind of keep on going with this image, but these are the basics of portrait editing here inside the Perfect Photo Suite 8.